If you rewind human history, the written word vanishes almost immediately. 99% of our entire story happened before anyone invented writing. In India, this era, known as the Prehistoric Period, stretches from roughly 200,000 BC all the way down to 3,500 BC. To understand these people, we have to look for evidence that was never intended to leave a record. During the Ice Age, early humans in the subcontinent survived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. They relied on unpolished, heavy hand axes like these to process food and defend themselves. This is the Paleolithic toolkit. Finding the right rocks to craft these tools was a matter of survival. Humans actively sought out limestone-rich areas, setting up large-scale stone-chipping camps. They found shelter from the extreme weather in places like the massive natural caves at Bhimbetka, turning them into combined living spaces and workshops. These crude, discarded stones and rock shelters are our earliest forensic evidence. They provide the physical baseline for every complex society that follows. Around 10,000 BC, the planet warms up, the ice melts, and across the subcontinent, vast grasslands emerge. A new landscape required new technology. Welcome to the Mesolithic Age. Humans engineered microliths, miniaturized, sharp, thin stone blades crafted from fine-grained rocks like silica. The expansive new grasslands supported smaller, much faster animals like deer and wild sheep. You cannot hunt a deer with a heavy rock. You need a lightweight, precise projectile. These Mesolithic groups documented their hunts and rituals in detailed rock paintings, leaving behind over 150 galleries across India. By 6000 BC, the Neolithic Age arrives. Humans observe the breeding cycles of animals and the growth patterns of wild grains. They domesticate dogs, sheep, and goats, and at sites like Kuldiwa, they begin cultivating rice. When you harvest crops, you suddenly have an excess of food. To protect and store their surplus grains, these early farmers invented clay pottery. Agriculture and grain storage meant humans no longer had to follow migrating herds. They could stay in one place. The very first settled Indian villages took root. The reliance on pure stone finally ends with the Chalcolithic Age. Humans learned to extract copper, integrating metal tools into their daily routines. Permanent village societies like the Malwa and Jorwe cultures begin to dominate central India and Maharashtra. But jump forward to roughly 1000 BC in southern India, and the archaeological record yields a structural surprise. We find enormous stone monuments known as megaliths. At sites like Brahmagiri, communities hoisted giant rock slabs to construct permanent burial chambers for the dead. Hauling boulders of this size requires dozens of people working together for a single purpose. Human energy had shifted away from pure survival, funneling into intense religious rituals and honoring ancestors. By documenting the specific objects buried alongside the dead, historians can reconstruct the social structure of the living. This data from Brahmagiri reveals a stark contrast. On one side, a skeleton is buried with 33 gold beads, stone gems, and copper bangles. On the other side, a skeleton is interred with just 2 plain clay pots. We also find evidence of severe demographic hardships. In western Maharashtra, excavations beneath the floors of Chalcolithic homes revealed numerous infant burials. The volume of remains point to staggeringly high infant mortality rates during this period. By 1000 BC, this overlaps with the Iron Age. Iron weapons spread across the subcontinent, and slowly the earliest written records begin to appear, drawing the prehistoric period to a close. The chipped stones, the painted caves, and the unequal gold bead distribution reveal a dynamic, technologically advancing world. By the time writing arrived, India had already developed the complex village hierarchies, agricultural systems, and wealth divides that would define the Harappan civilization. For decades, the British Empire justified its presence in India through a specific worldview. This historical photograph captures that dynamic, the belief in the white man's burden, where the colonizer viewed the subcontinent as an inherently barbaric landscape that required European intervention to find order. English philosophers like James Mill argued that the East was historically uncultured. He promoted the idea of tolerant imperialism, claiming the British were not there to exploit, but to civilize a population that had no history of its own to be proud of. That narrative began to collapse in the 1920s. Led by Indian archaeologists like Daya Ram Sahni and R.D. Banerjee, the Archaeological Survey of India began unearthing massive urban ruins at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These excavations yielded physical evidence of a culture that had mastered urban planning 4 millennia before the British arrived. The discovery of these cities provided the proof needed to challenge the claim that the West held a monopoly on civilization. By 2600 BCE, this society had entered its mature Harappan phase. While many European populations were still organized in small, tribal settlements, the Indus Valley had already established a complex, integrated urban network. The sheer scale of the civilization was staggering. It spanned across modern-day India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, covering a landmass that dwarfed its famous contemporaries in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. The existence of such a massive, organized territory proved that the foundations of global civilization were being laid in the East long before the Western world took its modern shape. Harappan cities had a clear structure. To the west, an elevated citadel housed the ruling class, while the eastern lower town contained common homes. This layout followed a strict grid system with major streets intersecting at right angles, keeping the city organized. This stratification shows a society organized by status and power, yet it lacked the birth-based rigidity of the formal caste system that emerged in later centuries. Harappan engineers achieved this level of civic standardization 4,500 years ago using basic tools, reaching a level of precision that many modern cities still fail to replicate. Underground, baked brick drains removed waste from nearly every home, utilizing vertical pipes and sediment traps to prevent blockages. The most iconic structure in Mohenjo-Daro is the Great Bath. This massive brick basin was likely used for ritual purification, featuring 2 sets of stairs leading into a central pool. To make the structure watertight, the builders applied a thick layer of natural bitumen to the floor and walls, an early and effective use of chemical waterproofing. While other civilizations of this era prioritized monuments to individual kings, the Harappans focused their greatest engineering efforts on public health and sanitation. Their social values are reflected in their art. This steatite bust, known as the Priest King, features a detailed beard and an intricate trefoil pattern on the robe, indicating a high level of craft and specialized clothing. Metallurgy was equally advanced. Using the lost wax casting method, they created the famous dancing girl, a bronze figure posed in a natural 3-bend tribanda stance, wearing bangles from her shoulder to her wrist. Their economy relied on seals like this one, featuring the Pashupati deity. These were used to stamp clay tags on trade goods, ensuring authenticity as they traveled to markets as far away as Mesopotamia. Because their written language remains undeciphered, these artifacts are the primary evidence of their success, proving the Indus Valley was a global center for trade and artistic innovation. Around 1900 BCE, environmental changes and drying riverbeds forced the population to leave their cities and migrate toward the Ganges Valley. Their knowledge survived the move. The Harappan mathematical system, based on multiples of 16, persisted in India for thousands of years, eventually appearing in the colonial-era currency system, where 16 annas made 1 rupee. The agricultural and civic foundations laid by the Harappans didn't disappear. They provided the structural blueprint for the rise of later Indian powers, like the Kingdom of Magadha. The British Empire controlled the subcontinent for 2 centuries, largely by claiming that India had no history of sophisticated self-governance or urban success. The discovery of the Indus Valley provided the physical evidence to dismantle that claim. It returned a sense of ancient history to the people of the subcontinent, proving that their ancestors had built one of the world's first great urban civilizations. By 2500 BCE, the signature of a superpower was unmistakable: a god king commanding a conscripted labor force to build funerary monuments outlasting the stars. In contemporary Mesopotamia, authority was projected through heavy military infrastructure and towering ziggurats designed to humble the population. But further east, a civilization spanning over 1 million square kilometers was taking a different path. It occupied more territory than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, stretching from the foothills of the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea. Archaeologists unearthing these urban centers found meticulously organized brick streets, but a complete absence of royal palaces, statues of conquerors, or specialized weapons of war. This presents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of ancient power. This society maintained strict architectural and cultural uniformity across thousands of miles, without a visible military or a centralized cult of personality. Current theories suggest the Indus Valley was governed by a sophisticated network of merchants and landowners rather than a dynasty of warlords. In cities like Mohenjo-Daro, the most imposing structure is the Great Granary. This brick platform facility functioned as the state's central treasury, where taxes were collected and stored in the form of grain. To manage this economy, they developed precise binary and decimal weights. These identical cubes are found in nearly every settlement, ensuring a merchant in the mountains and a trader on the coast worked from the same ledger. This logistical precision enabled a global reach. Mesopotamian records refer to the region as Meluha, a primary source for gold, carnelian, and the world's first export of woven cotton from the port of Lothal. In this model, the civilization was held together by the gravity of trade. Mutual economic benefit acted as a more effective stabilizer than the threat of a standing army. Architectural remains show a clear divide between the elevated citadel, the likely administrative seat, and the lower town. However, even the smaller private residences show a high standard of construction and access to shared resources. The Indus builders prioritized the living over the divine. They engineered the Great Bath, a sophisticated, bitumen-lined public basin, rather than diverting labor to massive tombs. This focus on public welfare extended to the world's first underground brick drains. Nearly every home had access to a sophisticated sanitation network, reflecting a systemic cultural obsession with public health. The archaeological record is dominated by intricate fashion, such as carnelian necklaces, shining gold fillets, and blue lapis beads. Excavations even reveal lipstick, face paint, and diverse hairstyles, suggesting a society that valued individual aesthetics over military display. By directing its collective wealth toward infrastructure and personal quality of life, the Indus Valley achieved a level of urban stability that did not require a warrior class to maintain. Despite the lack of formal religious buildings, terracotta figurines and seals depicting deities in yogic postures suggest a secular, nature-based belief system rooted in fertility and the natural world. Their mercantile seals carry a complex pictographic script written in bostraphoden, where text direction alternates every line. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Sumerian cuneiform, this script remains completely undeciphered. The Indus language is a silent record. Because we cannot read their laws or their literature, our entire understanding of this peaceful urban network relies on the forensic evidence left behind in the brick and the silt. Around 1900 BCE, that record takes a dark turn. Major cities began to decline, and in several homes, families buried their valuables beneath the floors, a final act of desperation that they never returned to reclaim. For decades, historians believed this collapse was caused by an invasion of horse-riding Aryans who purportedly slaughtered the peaceful population. This theory was built on the discovery of 39 skeletons found grouped in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, seemingly left where they fell during a final battle. Modern skeletal analysis has dismantled this narrative. Only 2 of those 39 skeletons showed signs of physical trauma, and even those were old, healed wounds. The lack of battle injuries, combined with the scattered placement of the bodies, suggests the population was being decimated by an epidemic or a biological crisis rather than a military conquest. Even in its final years, the Indus Valley remains free of evidence for large-scale warfare. The collapse was not triggered by a human enemy. By 1900 BCE, the civilization was being dismantled by severe hydrological shifts. Topographic data shows the Gagar-Hakra River drying up, while the vital Yamuna and Sutlej rivers shifted their courses. The urban centers were physically abandoned by the water that sustained them. Archaeological evidence in Dholavira shows that massive tectonic earthquakes simultaneously shattered the city's complex water harvesting infrastructure, rendering their reservoirs useless. The fallout was immediate. Crop production failed, the trade routes to Mesopotamia collapsed, and the population was forced to disperse into small, rudimentary farming villages. It would take 1,500 years for megacities of this scale to reappear on the Indian subcontinent. The sophisticated urban knowledge of the Indus Valley was almost entirely lost to time. The Indus Valley civilization proves that a highly advanced secular society can exist without the sword. But their disappearance is a reminder that even the most carefully planned civilizations exist at the mercy of a changing climate. Around 1500 BC, the urban centers of the Indus Valley stood largely empty. Their complex trade networks and brick-and-mortar cities had dissolved, leaving the northern subcontinent in a state of quiet transition. Small groups of Indo-Aryan tribes navigated the high, freezing passes of the Hindu Kush. These families moved as semi-nomadic units, seeking new grazing lands. These migrants lacked a centralized imperial command or heavy siege engines. Their movements were dictated by the seasons and the biological needs of their livestock, not by a plan for territorial conquest. This is the Rig Veda. Its 1,028 hymns were composed and memorized by generations of poets, preserving the specific details of a culture that left behind no permanent buildings or stone monuments. To find the foundation of the subcontinent's oldest living traditions, we have to look past the monuments of later empires. We must focus on a society defined by tribal kinship and the communal fire. These tribes settled in the Sapta Sindhu, or the land of 7 rivers. This region encompassed the fertile plains of the Indus and the lost Saraswati. The Zend-Avesta of ancient Iran uses a vocabulary nearly identical to early Vedic Sanskrit. Both texts share specific terms for their rituals, their gods, and their social structures. These same linguistic patterns appear in the Greek epics of Homer. The Vedic tribes are part of a broader Indo-European tapestry that stretches from the Ganges to the Mediterranean. This map tracks the word for horse as it radiates from a common root. The Vedic Ashva is a direct cognate to the Avestan Asva and the Latin equus, reflecting a shared ancestry of horse-drawn chariotry. Their economy functioned on mobile wealth. While land was a communal resource, cows served as the primary currency and the sole measure of a family's standing. Cattle were so central to their existence, the Rig Veda uses the word gavisti to describe conflict. Translated literally, their word for war meant the search for cows. For the early Aryans, the survival of the herd and the survival of the tribe were the same. Their movements and their violence were driven by the daily needs of their livestock. Because the tribe was constantly moving, the leader, or Rajan, was a war chief rather than an absolute monarch. He lacked a permanent army, and his titles defined him as the protector of the cattle. The Rajan answered to tribal assemblies called the Sabha and Samiti. These were public forums for debate, where women spoke and voted alongside men on issues of resource management. Early Vedic society was highly fluid. Occupations shifted according to individual choice rather than ancestry, and the rigid social restrictions of later centuries were entirely absent. Their religion avoided permanent shrines or physical icons. Instead, they invoked the forces of nature through the yajna, feeding offerings into a ritual fire to communicate with the unseen. Indra represented the storm and the battlefield, while Agni acted as the messenger within the fire. Their hymns are lists of tangible requests: more rain for the grass, more healthy sons, and more cattle for the pens. This was a society bound by blood and immediate necessity. Their world was egalitarian and pragmatic, shaped by the harsh demands of life on the move. Tribal competition eventually escalated into a major military confrontation. Known as the Battle of 10 Kings, it occurred on the banks of the river Ravi. The Bharata chief, Sudas, faced a massive alliance of 10 powerful tribes. It was a clash for supremacy that would determine who controlled the fertile plains of the north. Sudas secured a total victory, ensuring the Bharata tribe's dominance. This single battle established the identity of the region, eventually giving the country its name, Bharat. By 1000 BC, the focus shifted from the herd to the field. As tribes settled into the upper Gangetic Basin, they cleared land for permanent agriculture and began to build fixed villages. Fixed land ownership and the management of agricultural surpluses created new social pressures. This transition coincides with the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, a later edition that contains the first mention of the 4 Varnas, reflecting a society beginning to organize itself into a tiered hierarchy. The nomadic herders of the Vedic age provided the subcontinent with its enduring language, its foundational hymns, and its core rituals. Their legacy remains the fabric of the culture that survives today. For 500 years, the people of the early Vedic age lived on the move. Before 1000 BC, society was largely organized around egalitarian, semi-nomadic tribes herding cattle across the plains and worshipping the raw forces of nature. But around 1000 BC, these tribes pushed eastward. They migrated out of the Punjab and deep into the dense, fertile region known as the Ganga-Yamuna Doab. We can trace this exact migration in the soil. Excavations across northern India reveal hundreds of settlements defined by a specific type of pottery, painted gray ware. 2 major discoveries drove this expansion. First, they began forging tools out of iron, which the Vedic texts call Shaima Ayas, or black metal. Armed with iron axes, they cleared the eastern forests and transitioned from growing basic barley to cultivating high-yield crops like rice and wheat. Cultivating these new crops demanded months of stationary labor. You have to prepare the soil, plant the seeds, and wait for the harvest. The tribes could no longer wander. They had to anchor themselves to specific plots of dirt. With grain in the granary and roots in the ground, the tribe was no longer a moving community, but a fixed target. This transition created new logistical demands of ownership, storage, and defense that the old nomadic customs were not designed to manage. This map shows how those small, wandering tribes, or janas, fused into fixed territories. They formed massive political domains called Janapadas, creating organized kingdoms like Kuru and Panchala. In the early days, tribal leaders made decisions through open assemblies known as Sabha and Samiti. But as borders hardened, power concentrated into the hands of a small ruling elite, and those democratic bodies lost their authority. Leaders were no longer elected by the tribe. Kingship became a hereditary position, passed down from father to son, with monarchs claiming absolute control over the land and everyone on it. To legitimize this massive land grab, kings used public spectacle as propaganda. In a ritual called the Ashvamedha, the monarch released a royal horse to run freely. Any territory the horse crossed was claimed by the king, establishing unquestionable control over the region. The need to defend these lucrative agricultural borders effectively ended the old egalitarian days. To protect the harvest, tribal equality was replaced by centralized monarchy, giving birth to the state. Managing vast agricultural tracts and defending permanent borders requires a massive, organized labor force. A sprawling kingdom cannot function if everyone is doing everything. This chart shows the 4-tier Varna system, society divided into ruling Kshatriyas, ritual-performing Brahmanas, and economy-managing Vaishyas. These top tiers shared a privilege, the Upanaya sacred thread. The lowest tier, Shudras, was explicitly excluded, locked out of mobility to serve the orders above. This stratification happened at home, too. A strict patrimonial system took hold, placing total authority in the hands of the father. Women, who once sat in the tribal assemblies, were pushed out of the public sphere and placed into subordinate roles. There were rare exceptions. We have records of certain female philosophers participating in high-level theological debates, but for the vast majority, the boundaries of daily life tightened severely. To monopolize the wealth generated by settled farming, the ruling classes engineered a permanent hierarchy. They built a system where power and prosperity were protected by deliberate exclusion. As the physical world changed, so did the spiritual one. The ancient gods of nature, like the thunder god Indra, faded from prominence. In their place, Prajapati, the creator, was elevated to the supreme position. Worship shifted away from simple prayers and evolved into a cult of sacrifice. Kings funded massive public sacrifices to constantly assert their dominance, while wealthy citizens performed intricate domestic versions at home. These rituals were dangerous to get wrong. The specific formulas and chants were rigorously codified in later Vedic texts, requiring exact precision to execute correctly. Only the Brahmana priestly class knew how to read these specialized phonetic instructions. Because they held a total monopoly on this knowledge, they commanded massive payments, known as dakshina, often demanding herds of cattle and caches of gold to complete the rites. Religion functioned as a mechanism for wealth transfer. The complex demands of the sacrifices allowed the priestly class to continuously siphon resources directly out of the agrarian economy. By 500 BC, this system reached a breaking point. The rituals demanded the continuous slaughter of animals, literally incinerating the very cattle needed to plow the fields and sustain the economy. Rulers and commoners alike began to chafe under the absolute dominance of the priests. The endless demands for gold and livestock were visibly draining the kingdoms of their hard-earned surplus. This economic strain sparked an ideological rebellion. Thinkers began to reject the expensive external rituals, arguing that true understanding didn't require slaughtering a cow or paying a priest. This wave of philosophical defiance produced a new body of texts, the Upanishads. They offered a path to knowledge through internal contemplation, rather than external wealth. Where the old religion relied on costly physical spectacle, the Upanishads turned inward. They focused entirely on the concept of Atman, the self, and its connection to the supreme reality of Brahma. The transition from wandering tribes to permanent settlements established the foundations for the territorial states, social hierarchies, and philosophical inquiries that define the region today. Over the centuries, continental religious movements like Buddhism swept across Asia, only to eventually fade from their birthplace in India. Yet, quietly sitting in the background of that history is a faith that never left. That faith is Jainism. Today, Jains make up less than 0.5% of India's population, but they maintain an active, highly visible presence and wield significant economic influence across the country. Looking at its rulebook, this survival is an anomaly. Jainism demands extreme physical hardship from its monks. It rarely enjoyed the backing of imperial royal armies. And crucially, it outright banned its followers from participating in the single most common job in human history, farming. Jainism demonstrates how rigid, uncompromising rules can inadvertently engineer a highly protected, nearly invincible economic niche. To see how they did it, we have to rewind to the 6th century BCE. Indian society was locked into the rigid Varna, or caste system, where the Brahmin priestly class retained total spiritual authority. Right below them, the Kshatriya warrior class and the Vaishya merchant class were growing increasingly frustrated. They possessed military and economic power, but the rituals of the era remained the exclusive domain of the priests. Out of this frustration emerged Vardhamana Mahavira. Born a Kshatriya prince, he walked away from his royal life at age 30. He spent 12 years living in complete silence and extreme asceticism, eventually achieving omniscience to become the Jina, or conqueror. Mahavira applied an extreme version of ahimsa, absolute nonviolence, to every aspect of life. The rules were so strict that followers were forbidden from plowing fields, because turning the soil would inevitably kill insects and earthworms. In an ancient world where over 90% of the population survived by growing food, banning agriculture was a high-risk gamble for any movement. But Mahavira's timing aligned with a rapid technological shift, the arrival of heavy iron tools in the mid-Gangetic plains. Armed with iron axes, people cleared dense forests and settled into vast agricultural hubs, birthing major urban centers like Varanasi and Vaishali. These new cities fueled trade, which led to the invention of punch-marked silver coins. This standardized money accelerated commerce, creating a wealthy merchant class. These merchants, the Vaishyas, found themselves in a bind. They were generating enormous wealth, but traditional Brahmanical law books condemned moneylending, keeping them at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They possessed capital but lacked social standing. They desperately needed an ideological framework that validated their wealth without relying on the priests who looked down on them. Jainism offered exactly the framework they needed. Mahavira taught that a person's worth was determined by their actions and karma, not by the caste they were born into. This funnel illustrates ahimsa as an economic catalyst. Barred from fighting wars and farming the land, the entire Jain community was channeled into trade and commerce. This pacifism offered built-in protection. Non-violent communities rarely fought wars, keeping trade routes open and maximizing profits. This wealth would soon be tested. Shortly after Mahavira's death, a severe 12-year famine struck the Magadha region. To survive, a large group of Jains migrated south to Karnataka. When the famine ended and the groups reunited, they split over the strictness of their asceticism. The religion divided into two enduring sects, the Digambras, who completely renounced clothing, and the Shvetambras, who adopted simple white robes. Jain followers survived while land-bound agrarian communities starved because they were mobile merchants with liquid wealth rather than tied to failing crops. Despite its economic success, Jainism never captured the broader Indian masses. The harsh requirements of fasting and severe physical renunciation were simply incompatible with the life of a typical ancient farmer. The religion also faced aggressive opposition from the Brahmin establishment, and it rarely secured the dedicated patronage of the largest regional empires. This structure reveals why that lack of mass appeal was actually their greatest defense. Sprawling agrarian populations are completely dependent on whoever wears the crown. In contrast, the Jains formed a tight, concentrated network independent of the political hierarchy. By dominating the absolute bottlenecks of the economy, credit and long-distance trade, they insulated themselves. When a kingdom collapsed, the new rulers still needed bankers to function. Becoming economically indispensable to a society is a much stronger long-term survival strategy than trying to convert its rulers. This concentration of resources allowed a small population to leave an outsized cultural footprint. By rejecting elite Sanskrit to preach and write in Prakrit, early Jains helped lay the foundation for regional languages like modern Marathi and Kannada. Their concentrated mercantile wealth funded some of the most intricate architecture in Indian history, seen today in the carved marble of the Dewara temples. They erected towering monuments like the Gomateshvara monolith in Karnataka, relying entirely on the private resources of their own community rather than state treasuries. And their core philosophy rippled through time. Thousands of years after Mahavira, his strict interpretation of ahimsa became the direct inspiration for Mahatma Gandhi's strategy of nonviolent resistance. Jainism proves that an ideology doesn't need to conquer the globe to endure. By maintaining absolute conviction and mastering a vital economic niche, a small community built a cultural blueprint that continues to thrive 2,500 years later. You can travel to Japan, to Tibet, or to Sri Lanka today and find societies deeply structured around the teachings of Buddhism. It is a massive, enduring global religion. Yet, if you return to the Indian subcontinent, the exact place where it was born, it has almost entirely vanished. To understand why, we have to rewind to the 6th century BC. In the Ganga-Yamuna Doab of North India, agricultural and trade economies were booming. But the society driving that economy was paralyzed by a rigid Varna system. This was a hierarchy based entirely on birth, heavily weighted at the bottom by a massive lower class trapped in disenfranchisement, with zero upward mobility. People actively sought a way out of this social stricture. They looked for spiritual alternatives, but options like Jainism demanded a level of austerity and self-deprivation that was inaccessible to everyday people trying to survive. With a booming economy locked inside a stagnant social hierarchy, ancient Indian society had become a pressure cooker. It required a disruptor who could offer a path to salvation that didn't require elite birthright or physical starvation. Siddhartha Gautama was born into a royal family and sheltered in opulence until his late 20s. When he stepped outside his palace, he was confronted with 4 sights: an old man, a sick man, a dead body, and a wandering ascetic. Exposure to these harsh realities of human suffering drove him to abandon his life of luxury completely and forever. After years of wandering and meditating, he achieved enlightenment at the age of 35, under a peepal tree in Bodh Gaya. From that moment on, he became the Buddha. He spent the next 4 decades walking across North India, sharing a philosophy he called the middle path. He observed the extreme luxury of the ruling elite and the severe self-punishment of the ascetics, and he rejected both. This diagram outlines his alternative, the Eightfold Path. The Buddha stripped away the need for complex Brahminical rituals, animal sacrifices, or even a supreme deity. Instead, he presented human suffering as a problem caused by desire and offered these 8 logical steps, like right action, right speech, and right livelihood, as a practical, self-guided process to overcome it. Anyone, regardless of their birth, could follow these steps. By making salvation an internal, individual process, the Buddha built an egalitarian framework that bypassed the established religious gatekeepers. The rapid spread of Buddhism relied on a very specific set of organizational strategies. First, they tackled the language barrier. Sanskrit was the guarded language of the intellectuals. The Buddha refused to use it, preaching instead in Pali, the everyday language of the masses. Then he established the Sanghas, monastic orders built on radical inclusivity. Women and Shudras were explicitly permitted to join. The moment they entered the Sangha, the suffocating rules of the Varna hierarchy no longer applied. The movement also aligned with the shifting economy. The Buddhists strictly opposed animal sacrifice and emphasized the protection of cattle. In a society relying on new heavy plow agriculture, preserving livestock meant preserving wealth. This practical stance won the intense financial loyalty of the rising Vaishya merchant class. To ensure these teachings survived, the monks within the Sangha systematically memorized the Buddha's spoken rules. Eventually, they were recorded on palm leaf manuscripts, physically codifying the movement. Buddhism solved the exact linguistic, social, and economic pain points of the middle and lower classes. It functioned with the efficiency of a highly successful ancient startup. Following the Buddha's death, massive councils were organized by kings to standardize the religion. They compiled the core teachings and rules into 3 distinct volumes, known as the Pitakas. This royal backing acted as an accelerant. Centuries later, Emperor Ashoka embraced the religion. He deployed vast state resources and established a missionary network, exporting Buddhist teachings to Central Asia, the West, and Sri Lanka. By the 1st century AD, under King Kanishka, the movement was fully institutionalized. You can see the shift in power by looking at the gold coins from the era, with the standing figure of the Buddha minted directly onto the state currency. But this massive scale created internal friction. During Kanishka's 4th council, a permanent ideological fracture occurred. The religion split in 2, the Hinayana sect, which committed to the original teachings, and the Mahajana sect, which elevated the Buddha to a god and openly embraced idol worship. Aligning with imperial powers turned Buddhism into a global phenomenon. However, by joining the political establishment, the movement drifted away from the simple, grassroots origins that made it popular in the first place. By the 7th century, a stark historical irony had played out. The radical disruptor had mutated into the kind of wealthy, exclusionary establishment it was built to tear down. The humble sanghas had evolved into sprawling, heavily funded monasteries. Massive academic centers like Nalanda were operating essentially as local governments, collecting taxes and revenue from hundreds of surrounding villages to sustain themselves. As the monasteries grew richer, the monks within them became isolated. They abandoned Pali, the language of the commoners, and adopted Sanskrit, the language of intellectuals, cutting themselves off from the everyday people they used to serve. Later sects, like Vajrayana, began introducing highly secretive, complex rituals requiring specialized knowledge. They were directly mirroring the exclusionary systems the Buddha had expressly forbidden. While Buddhist institutions decayed internally, Brahmanism launched a massive reform. They promised admission to heaven for women and Shudras, and co-opted the Buddhist principle of protecting cattle, effectively absorbing the very demographics they had lost centuries prior. By morphing into a bloated intellectual aristocracy, the movement severed its connection to the very human suffering it was meant to solve. The audience it once championed now felt alienated. Weakened from within and lacking the support of the local populace, these wealthy monasteries became targets. Orthodox rulers began violently persecuting the monks and destroying their sacred sites. The fatal blow arrived in the 12th century. Turkish invaders pushed into the region and systematically targeted the undefended monasteries specifically for their hoarded wealth. The monks were slaughtered, and the physical centers of the religion were wiped out. Buddhism effectively vanished from the Indian mainland, but its philosophical DNA remains embedded in the subcontinent's values, most clearly in the concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence. This fusion birthed the Gandhara art style, leaving a legacy of draped robes and circular halos that defined Indian sculpture for centuries. It is a reminder that the first human statues ever worshipped in India were of the Buddha. The life cycle of Buddhism in India reveals a distinct historical pattern. Massive human institutions often trend toward wealth and eventual collapse, but the core ideas that built them, like radical compassion and equality, can escape those borders and change the world forever. When we think of the first great Indian empires, our minds usually jump straight to the Mauryas, specifically Ashoka and his famous lion capital. Or we might fast forward past them, picturing the massive territorial reach of the Mughals centuries later. We might even think of the formidable military expansion of the Marathas under Shivaji Maharaj. But the actual process of empire building on the subcontinent didn't begin with any of these famous dynasties. The true origin of India's large territorial states goes all the way back to the 6th century BCE, during a period historians call the second phase of urbanization. Before kings could carve out a sprawling empire, the very concept of a defined state had to be hammered into existence by a massive collision of human migration, new technology, and physical geography. Back in the later Vedic period, a major migration began. People pushed steadily eastward toward the lower Gangetic plains, settling across regions of modern-day Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. They were moving toward a highly specific geographic asset: dense, rich iron mines. The widespread extraction of iron triggered two simultaneous technological leaps. First, blacksmiths forged highly durable, lethal iron weaponry. Second, farmers gained heavy iron plows capable of cutting deep into the tough, clay-heavy soil of the Ganges basin. At the same time, new religious movements like Buddhism and Jainism were gaining traction. Their strict emphasis on nonviolence actively discouraged animal sacrifice. This protected the regional cattle population, providing the essential animal labor needed to pull those heavy iron plows and drive an enormous agricultural boom. With more efficient farming and ample animal labor, the region began producing a massive food surplus. For the first time, ruling classes had excess resources they could systematically collect in the form of taxes. A continuous, reliable stream of tax revenue allowed leaders to pay and maintain permanent, standing armies. Instead of living as nomadic tribes, people tethered themselves to specific pieces of land with their military, forming what became known as a Janapada, literally the foothold of a tribe. Armed with iron weapons, massive food reserves, and funded militaries, these newly settled tribes drew hard borders. This explosion of wealth and power rapidly condensed into 16 distinct, massive territorial states, and almost immediately they were forced into a fierce existential debate over exactly how a state should be governed. If you look at this historical map, you can see the scale of these 16 ancient states, the Mahajanapadas. They blanketed an enormous swath of territory, stretching from the northwestern frontiers of Gandhara down to the Asaka region, well past the Vindhya Mountains. But the physical boundaries are only half the story. Inside these territories, two completely different operating systems of government were competing for dominance. The first system was the monarchy, seen in powerful states like Magadha and Kosala. These states were ruled by a single hereditary king, maintained strict social hierarchies, and relied heavily on the political guidance of Brahmin priests. This structure was engineered for highly efficient top-down control. All tax revenue flowed directly to the crown, allowing the king to build, feed, and command a singular, heavily centralized military machine. Right next door operated the opposing system, the Gana Sanghas, famously utilized by states like Vaji and Malla. These states formed through ideological resistance. As social restrictions and Brahmin authority grew increasingly rigid throughout the later Vedic period, certain groups splintered off. They rejected the heavy religious hierarchy in favor of a simpler, tribal lifestyle. Instead of answering to a single monarch, power in a Ganasanga was shared. They operated as a confederation, governed by a council of Kshatriya chiefs, who gathered in an assembly to elect a leader. It is tempting to look at this voting system and call it a democracy, but that is a highly modernized stretch. In reality, women, lower classes, and outsiders were entirely barred from the assembly. It was an exclusive oligarchy designed to keep power concentrated within a few elite ruling families. Yet, even as imperfect oligarchies, the Ganasangas presented a dangerous alternative to the neighboring kings. Their decentralized, collective approach to power directly challenged the absolute authority of the monarchs, making an all-out collision between the two systems entirely unavoidable. As these agricultural engines expanded, their borders inevitably crashed into one another, sparking a long and brutal series of military campaigns. In this fight for supremacy, the kingdom of Magadha possessed extreme geographic advantages. Its capital, Rajgir, was naturally fortified, tucked between protective rivers and tightly surrounded by a ring of 5 steep hills, making it incredibly difficult for invading armies to penetrate. Meanwhile, the Ganasanghas suffered from a fatal structural flaw. In a crisis, a council-based assembly debates and deliberates, which takes valuable time. Their fragmented, privately held armies simply could not react fast enough to match the swift, unified military command of a singular Magadhan king. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Magadhan rulers like Ajatashatru capitalized on these weaknesses. They systematically targeted the confederacies, breaking their alliances and annexing almost all of the Ganasanga territories into their own expanding state. The Mahajanapada period operated as an intense political laboratory for ancient India. The Ganasangas failed the ultimate test of survival, while the centralized high-tax monarchical system proved to be the winning formula, laying the structural groundwork for the subcontinent's first true empire. Look at India in the 6th century BC. Instead of a unified country, 16 separate kingdoms were locked in constant wars. Magadha seemed like just another player, but it systematically swallowed its neighbors to form a massive landmass. The empire they eventually built became so formidable that it would eventually force the greatest military conqueror in history to halt his eastward march and turn back. Out of 16 fiercely competitive states, how did this specific kingdom manage to outmaneuver everyone else and build ancient India's first pan-regional superpower? This unification happened through a precise alignment of factors: the tactical exploitation of natural resources, calculated political ambition, and a perfectly timed Western invasion. Magadha possessed a specific set of natural advantages. The region sat on top of rich iron ore mines, allowing for the mass production of superior weaponry. Above ground, the highly fertile soil generated the massive food surpluses required to sustain a professional standing army. They also utilized naturally impenetrable defenses. Take a look at this image of the river convergence near Pataliputra, their later capital. Situated exactly where rivers like the Ganga and Son meet, the city was protected by a massive natural water barrier. As we can see in this stone relief carving, they also drew strength from the dense eastern forests. While other states relied entirely on horses or chariots, Magadha captured and trained a devastating biological weapon: war elephants. Early rulers like Bimbisara and his son Ajatashatru weaponized these assets. They expanded their borders through a mix of calculated marriage alliances to secure diplomatic ties and direct military conquest to absorb neighboring territories. When the Nanda dynasty took control, they leveraged this accumulated wealth and implemented heavy taxation. They funneled those resources into a military force of unprecedented size, establishing total dominance over the subcontinent's resources. By the 4th century BC, Magadha had transformed into a hyper-militarized economic powerhouse. This ancient silver punch-marked coin provides physical proof of their reach, a standardized currency backing a centralized, wealthy state. While Magadha consolidated power in the east, a new threat appeared on the northwest border. In 326 BC, as shown in this marble bust, That threat was Alexander the Great. After navigating grueling terrain, like the harsh mountain passes seen in this photograph, Alexander marched into India. The northwest was divided into disorganized kingdoms, and his forces overran them with relative ease. But at the Beas River, the narrative shifted. Alexander's battle-hardened Greek troops abruptly mutinied, refusing to march any further east. They were exhausted by the climate, but more importantly, they were gripped by rumors of the Nanda dynasty's military. They were terrified by the prospect of facing hundreds of thousands of infantry and thousands of elephants wading across the river. Alexander was forced to retreat, eventually dying in Babylon. His sudden exit left the Northwest Territories without a leader, creating a massive geopolitical power vacuum. Two men stepped into this vacuum, a young leader named Chandragupta Maurya and his strategist, Chanakya. They recognized that the Nanda king, while wealthy, was deeply unpopular among his heavily taxed subjects. Chandragupta launched a decisive strike. He first secured the chaotic northwest, then turned east to overthrow the Nanda king in 321 BC. Finally, he secured his western borders by defeating Alexander's successor in the region, Seleucus Nicator. It was a historical irony. The retreat of a Greek conqueror and the local tyranny of a Nanda king provided the exact conditions Chandragupta needed to unify the subcontinent under a single banner. Winning an empire requires military force, but running one requires completely different tools. To maintain control over such a vast territory, Chandragupta shifted his focus from conquest to statecraft. He followed the Arthashastra, a manual for state engineering authored by Chanakya. It detailed strict protocols for everything from espionage and tax collection to managing a centralized military. Chandragupta used these principles to build a sophisticated administrative machine. As seen in this chart, the empire was divided into provinces managed by specialized departments handling revenue, justice, and the military. We have outside verification of this system from the Greek ambassador Megasthenes. In his text, the Indica, he described a complex societal structure and a capital city protected by massive fortifications. At the height of his power, Chandragupta performed a final surprising act. He retired to become a Jain monk, passing the throne peacefully and spending the rest of his life in the serene hills of Shravanbelagola, seen here. Chandragupta's retirement marked a shift in Indian history. His administration had transformed Magadh into the template for a centralized, unified state. He left behind a functional imperial machine. It was this stable foundation that allowed his grandson, Ashoka the Great, to later inherit the throne and spread Mauryan influence across the entire subcontinent. Take a look at this carving. These 4 lions form the lion capital, the ultimate symbol of the world's largest modern democracy, India. Yet this symbol of peace was built over 2 millennia ago by a man originally known as Chandashoka, which translates to the brutal. Ashoka secured his grip on the ancient Mauryan Empire through extreme violence. Historical texts claim he won the throne only after systematically slaughtering his 99 brothers. We have to look at how the ancient world's most bloodthirsty autocrat eventually became its premier architect of peace and public welfare. Under Ashoka's predecessors, the Mauryan Empire was a wealthy continental powerhouse, but it carried a massive structural flaw. Its standing military was extraordinarily expensive to maintain. As this diagram shows, the state relied heavily on land revenue to fund those soldiers. To pay the troops, the empire needed more land, which required constant military conquest. That expansion, in turn, drove up military costs even further. This cycle climaxed in 260 BC at the Battle of Kalinga. Ashoka won the territory, but the aftermath was horrific. 100,000 people died, and massive starvation displaced over 1.5 million more. Walking the battlefield, Ashoka experienced a profound psychological shock. He realized that governing purely through military force and constant expansion was a self-destructive administrative trap. If an emperor abandons rule by fear and military might, what alternative system can possibly hold a fractured, continental-sized empire together? Ashoka found his answer in Buddhism. But rather than enforcing strict religious dogma on his subjects, he adapted its teachings into a pragmatic political philosophy called Dhamma, emphasizing a middle path of moderation and social ethics. He systematically rebranded his entire leadership style. The distant, fearsome tyrant positioned himself as a people's king, adopting the concept of paternal kingship, where citizens were to be treated like his own children. He enacted massive, state-funded welfare policies. His administration built state-funded hospitals, planted medicinal herbs across the country, and constructed extensive rest networks, providing food and shade for travelers. This was a highly calculated political system. By directly providing for his subjects, Ashoka secured extreme citizen loyalty, maintaining order across his vast territory without the exorbitant cost of military enforcement. To make this work, he had to overcome a severe logistical hurdle. He was governing a massive, diverse population using the slow, primitive communication technology of the ancient world. Here on this stone pillar is his solution: a permanent mass media network. He carved edicts directly into rock faces. Notice the characters. He didn't force a single imperial tongue, writing instead in regional languages like Pali, Prakrit, and Aramaic. Because most of the public was illiterate, local officials were ordered to read these edicts aloud. It created the powerful illusion that the emperor was speaking directly to every individual. Ashoka effectively invented ancient state broadcasting. He figured out how to project omnipresent authority and state ideology into the farthest corners of his empire without deploying a single soldier. Internally, he managed diverse populations through aggressive religious tolerance. Despite his personal Buddhist faith, Ashoka actively funded rival groups, like the Ajivika sect, to prevent ideological uprisings and social fracturing. He then turned this ideological machine outward. Ashoka convened the Third Buddhist Council to consolidate and formalize his philosophy for international export. Looking at this map of the ancient world, you can see the scale of his ambition. He deployed royal emissaries, including his own children, to spread Buddhism outward to Sri Lanka, Egypt, Greece, and Syria. You can still find the tangible legacy of these specific missions today. Take this massive sacred Bodhi tree in Sri Lanka. It was originally planted by Ashoka's emissaries. Exporting culture and shared ideology secured his international borders far more efficiently and cheaply than an occupying army. It serves as the ancient blueprint for modern soft power. Ashoka died in 232 BC, and shortly after his death, the Mauryan Empire rapidly crumbled. This rapid collapse sparked a long-running historical debate. Did Ashoka's strict policies of non-violence and demilitarization fatally weaken the state's military capability? Modern historians reject that idea. They argue that Ashoka's pacifism was actually a highly pragmatic survival strategy, designed to keep a bloated state economically solvent. The true causes of the Mauryan collapse were immense economic strain, a lack of successors capable of running his complex bureaucracy, and a wave of new foreign invasions. The fact that the empire fractured so quickly without him actually points to his unique political genius. His intricate system of public welfare and soft power was the only thing holding an impossible empire together. While the physical empire vanished, the concepts of Ashoka's statecraft survived to influence the frameworks of modern democratic nations. This is the Great Stupa at Sanchi. Its massive stone dome and intricate gateways remain standing today as a monument to his enduring ideology. His specific policies of religious tolerance and individual freedom offer a direct contrast to the challenges faced by modern societies still dealing with conflict. The English writer H.G. Wells noted that among the tens of thousands of monarchs that crowd the columns of history, the name of Ashoka shines almost alone, like a star. Ashoka's reign showed that welfare and Dhamma can win a more enduring conquest than any territory seized through violence. In 18 BC, the mighty Mauryan Empire, a massive centralized power that controlled nearly the entire Indian subcontinent, collapsed. Conventional history textbooks often bypass the next 5 centuries, labeling the span from 200 BC to 300 AD as a dark period. This label stems from the fact that the unified map of the subcontinent shattered. Instead of a singular imperial dynasty holding everything together, dozens of smaller kingdoms arose, constantly competing for territory. The term Dark Age leads us to expect an era defined by chaos, poverty, and cultural decay. However, the physical evidence left behind by the people of this era tells a different story. During this supposedly dark timeline, the first Indian gold coins entered circulation. We also see the sudden emergence of monumental stone carvings, including the first physical statues of the Buddha. Archaeological sites from this period are filled with high-value imports, such as this blue-tinted glass vessel shipped from the Roman Empire. If the region was truly in decline, why do we find evidence of India's most economically and culturally connected era? The fractured map wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a power vacuum that acted as a potent magnet, drawing in groups from the northwest like the Indo-Greeks, Sakas, Parthians, and Kushanas. These incoming powers did not destroy the local civilization. They settled down and assimilated into it. This Kushan coin provides the proof. On one side, the foreign king depicts himself in imperial dress. On the other, he features a local deity with a halo, signaling a deliberate merge with Indian traditions. Foreign-born rulers like Menander and Kanishka went further, converting to Buddhism and becoming the leading patrons of the faith. These waves of migration triggered a broad cultural fusion that enriched the entire subcontinent. Without a central emperor restricting movement, the subcontinent became the wealthy middleman of the ancient world. In the north, the Kushanas controlled a vital Silk Route section connecting China to the Mediterranean. Simultaneously, the Satavahanas established maritime routes from the Deccan Plateau to Roman ports. India exported pepper, pearls, and silk for vast Roman gold and wine. Political decentralization allowed these regional economies to hyper-specialize and dominate global trade. Without a supreme emperor to manage the state, who kept society functioning for 500 years? The answer lies in the trade guilds, highly organized networks of merchants and artisans who stepped up to fill the administrative void. These guilds operated as the institutional backbone of the era, serving as ancient banks providing loans, independent judicial courts for their members, and industrial regulators. Merchant wealth eventually surpassed imperial wealth, making these guilds the primary funders of temples, monasteries, and civic infrastructure. This period proves that decentralization can lead to empowered local classes and resilient community institutions. Historians likely labeled this a dark age because it was too messy. Without a single dynasty to follow, the era lacks a neat, linear narrative. While frustrating for scholars, for the people living through it, this was an era of prosperity and dynamic change. This wealth birthed new styles of art. The Gandhara school shows heavy Hellenistic influence in the facial features and the flowing, realistic folds of the robes. At the same time, indigenous artistic movements like the Mathura school flourished, creating a distinct native aesthetic in red sandstone. Political fragmentation did not signal decay. Instead, these 5 centuries of vibrant, cosmopolitan exchange provided the foundation required for India's next great expansion, the Gupta Empire. Before the 3rd century BC, the region south of the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers was defined by a culture that left no written records. Instead, we find these, massive stone dolmens and burial monuments, marking a prehistoric megalithic period, where history is written in stone rather than ink. A sudden change occurs around 300 BC. The silent stone monument culture is replaced by an advanced, highly organized civilization. Within a few generations, this landscape becomes a network of literate kingdoms and international trade hubs. We know this era exists because of the Pandya kings of Madurai. They sponsored the Sangams, legendary academies where hundreds of Tamil poets assembled to compile the era's knowledge into massive literary anthologies. While the earliest of these assemblies are lost to myth, the later texts survive. Etched into palm leaf manuscripts, these poems serve as an authentic time capsule of a society that would otherwise be invisible to history. These poetic anthologies provide the essential data for reconstructing the politics, social hierarchies, and economic networks of ancient South India. The Sangam texts describe a hereditary monarchy divided among three rival powers. Each dynasty ruled a distinct territory and identified itself with a royal emblem: the tiger, the fish, and the bow and arrow. The Cheras, symbolized by the bow and arrow, controlled the western coast. Their greatest ruler, Sengutuvan, was famous for his military expeditions into northern India and his control over the vital western ports of Musiri and Thondi. To the east, the Cholas, the tigers, dominated the fertile Kaveri Delta. Their king, Karikala, showcased his administration's reach by constructing a 160-kilometer embankment along the Kaveri River to manage the delta's agriculture. The Pandyas, ruled under the fish emblem from Madurai, controlled the southern tip of the peninsula. They used their wealth to patronize the very poets whose works allow us to map this era today. This constant tripartite struggle for supremacy drove a period of rapid state building. To maintain their borders and fund their armies, these kings had to develop sophisticated irrigation projects, professional navies, and the efficient tax systems described in the poetry. The Tolkappiyam, the oldest surviving work of this era, reveals a society that categorized its world through geography. They divided their environment into 5 specific ecological landscapes: the hills, the pastures, the agricultural plains, the coast, and the desert. Each landscape, or Tinai, had its own culture and spiritual life. In the hilly tracts, the people focused their worship on Lord Morrigan, a deity who became synonymous with the Tamil identity during this period. Social status was defined by a 4-class structure, but the poetry suggests a degree of social flexibility. Women could choose their partners in love marriages and pursue intellectual paths as poets, though they also lived within a martial culture that expected the ultimate sacrifice from widows. That martial culture is most visible in hero stones, or nadukal. These were erected to immortalize warriors who died in battle, turning the physical landscape into a map of ancestral bravery. This connection to the land was the primary influence on how the Sangam people organized their spiritual, social, and professional lives. The wealth mentioned in Sangam poetry was built on the sea. Port cities like Puhar and Musiri became international junctions, hosting merchant ships from across the Indian Ocean. These ports exported a massive volume of luxury goods, ranging from Pandya pearls and fine Uraiyur cotton to valuable spices like pepper, ginger, and cardamom. These internal Tamil accounts align perfectly with external perspectives from the West. Greek and Roman records from the 1st century confirmed that trade networks stretched from the southern tip of India all the way to the Mediterranean. The physical proof of this commerce is found in the soil. Hoards of gold and silver coins issued by Roman emperors like Augustus and Tiberius have been discovered across Tamil Nadu, providing a tangible link to the Roman economy. This relentless maritime commerce transformed regional kingdoms into global economic powers, funding the cultural explosion of the Sangam Age. Around 300 AD, the Sangam Age ended. A mysterious tribe known as the Kalabras invaded the region, disrupting the established order. The Chera, Chola, and Pandya dynasties lost their dominance, and the region entered an interim period that earlier historians described as a dark age. While the political structures collapsed, the literary heritage did not. The poems and grammar compiled during the Sangams survived the invasion, preserving the classical foundation of the culture. This period also saw the formal development of the Dravidian languages, providing the linguistic tools that would define the region for the next 2,000 years. The Sangam Age was the foundational era for South India. It established the cultural, economic, and political patterns that remain the bedrock of its identity today. For centuries, historical consensus has framed the Gupta Empire, spanning roughly 319 to 540 AD, as the ultimate political and economic peak of ancient India. Our modern reconstruction of this era doesn't come from a single, intact archive. Instead, historians triangulate the reality of the Guptas using 3 distinct types of surviving primary sources. The first is epigraphy. Massive physical inscriptions, like the famous Allahabad and Morali pillars, provide detailed, localized accounts of military conquests and imperial lineages carved directly into stone and iron. The second is numismatics. The Guptas minted extensive, highly standardized hoards of gold coins, offering hard physical evidence of their vast material wealth and the crafted iconography of their rulers. The third consists of literary texts. This includes the royal genealogies found in the Puranas, as well as the independent on-the-ground travelogues recorded by foreign visitors like the Chinese monk Foxian. But combining these sources reveals a severe contradiction. The Guptas managed to unify a massive subcontinent using a surprisingly liberal administrative state, while simultaneously engineering a deeply oppressive, rigid social hierarchy. We are going to deconstruct this dual reality. To gauge the Gupta legacy, we have to dismantle the facade of a purely golden age and analyze the severe social architecture they built beneath it. The empire begins with Chandragupta I. Rather than relying on brute force, he secures his foundational regional power through diplomacy, executing a highly strategic matrimonial alliance with a powerful Licchavi princess. His successor, Samudragupta, abandons diplomacy for total war. He initiates a calculated three-phase military campaign that rapidly expands the borders outward. Phase 1 targets his immediate neighbors. Through forceful subjugation and direct annexation of rival territories, Samudragupta secures absolute control over the fertile Gangetic plains. Phase 2 turns south. His armies march deep into the Deccan Peninsula, defeating 12 regional rulers. Recognizing the logistical impossibility of ruling the Deep South, he reinstates these kings, forcing them to pay heavy tribute instead of annexing their lands. In Phase 3, he pivots his massive military back to the north. Eliminating 9 major regional kings, he establishes absolute mastery over Aryavarta, consolidating North India into a single imperial bloc. This vast territory is inherited by Chandragupta II. To protect his borders, he marries into the Naga dynasty and marries his own daughter to a Vakataka prince, securing his flanks through strategic alliances. With his borders secure, he launches a massive strike against the western Saka satraps, utterly destroying their long-standing regional control in a brutal, decisive war. This massive victory pushes the Gupta borders all the way through Malwa and Gujarat to the Arabian Sea. By capturing these critical coastal ports, the empire gains direct, highly lucrative control over the maritime trade routes stretching to Europe. But conquering the subcontinent is easier than governing it. The sheer geographic scale of this new empire creates a logistical nightmare, forcing the Guptas to abandon the traditional model of absolute centralized control. The preceding Mauryan Empire ran on an intense, highly centralized bureaucratic machine. The Guptas realized that a top-down approach would fracture across their newly expanded borders. To solve this, they created the Kumara Amatyas. This was an elite, specialized cadre of administrators appointed directly by the central government, essentially acting as the connective tissue between the emperor and the distant provinces. The empire was divided into massive provinces, known as bukti. These regions were governed by members of the royal family or high-ranking officials drawn from the Kumara Amatyas, acting as semi-autonomous buffers. Beneath the provinces, power was delegated even further down to the district level, called the Vishaya, and finally rested at the smallest unit of administration, the village, managed by a local headman known as the Gramika. To sustain this vast decentralized machine, the state required immense revenue. Alongside standard agricultural taxes and forced labor levies, the Guptas began to rely heavily on a system of permanent land grants. Two main types emerged: Agrahara, which were tax-free lands given to Brahmins for their personal upkeep, and Devagrahara, vast tracts of land granted specifically for the maintenance of grand religious temples. This hands-off approach produced a surprising reality. According to the meticulous records of the Chinese traveler Foxian, the average citizen enjoyed significant personal freedom. State interference was minimal, corporal punishment was rare, and citizens could travel the empire largely unbothered by central authorities. By delegating power down to local districts and wealthy landowners, the Guptas traded absolute central control for widespread regional stability. But in doing so, they inadvertently laid the structural foundation for Indian feudalism. While the political administration remained famously liberal, the social reality on the ground was moving in the exact opposite direction. Driven by immense state patronage, institutional Brahmanism began to rapidly rigidify society. The relatively fluid Varna class framework began to systematically lock into the jati system. Your social standing and your occupation became strictly hereditary, forming impenetrable blocks of social segregation. The system adapted to the expanding empire by selectively absorbing new populations. Powerful foreign invaders settling in the northwest were granted legitimacy and assimilated into the warrior kshatriya class, while subjugated indigenous tribes were aggressively pushed down into the laboring Shudra class. Most severely, this era marks the systemic formalization of untouchability. The Smriti, written by the scholar Katyayana during this period, provides the first formal textual use of the word for untouchable, locking a permanent underclass into the social code. The same traveler, Foxian, who praised the empire's civic freedoms, also recorded the grim reality of the Chandala caste. Simply based on their birth, they were subjected to mandatory residential segregation, forced to live entirely outside the city limits. This strict social control extended rapidly to gender. Women's autonomy collapsed. The ancient practice of swayamvara, where a woman could choose her own husband, was abolished, replaced by a rigid mandate enforcing early, arranged marriages. Female property rights were largely erased. A woman's legal ownership was severely restricted, almost entirely limited to stridana, a localized term for the jewelry and clothing received upon marriage. By 510 AD, this systemic subjugation reaches its darkest extreme. The Aran inscription in central India provides the very first physical evidence of sati, the expectation of a widow dying on her husband's funeral pyre. The vaunted prosperity of the era was highly conditional. Economic and civic freedom existed, but access to it required strict adherence to a deeply oppressive state-sponsored hierarchy. Because the Guptas decentralized their political power, the survival of the central state relied entirely on the continuous, uninterrupted flow of massive wealth from their established trade routes. That wealth became the target of a sudden existential threat. Relentless waves of Central Asian pastoral nomads, the Huns, began launching devastating incursions through the northwestern passes. The Huns severed connections to the vital Arabian seaports, cutting off European trade. Without this maritime gold, the royal treasury went bankrupt. Unable to sustain the central administration, provincial governors stopped sending tribute, causing the decentralized empire to permanently fracture. The decline was steep. By 540 AD, central authority collapsed, and the political entity known as the Gupta Empire was completely erased from the map. The Guptas are celebrated for minting endless gold and conquering a massive subcontinent, but evaluating them strictly on material wealth misses their actual historical footprint. The empire dissolved, but the rigid social architecture they patronized did not. The strict caste divisions, the formalization of untouchability, and the severe subjugation of women survived long after the last Gupta king lost his throne. The Guptas unified a massive continent through brilliant administrative delegation, but their ultimate, lasting legacy. Historians use the term Golden Age to describe a rare, specific alignment in human history. It happens when an empire's internal stability, its accumulated wealth, and its cultural output all peak at the exact same moment. For ancient India, that peak was the Gupta Empire. Between the 4th and 6th centuries, their scholars conceptualized the mathematical zero and accurately calculated that the Earth rotates on its own axis. We can still see the physical proof of their metallurgical science standing in Delhi today. The Marali iron pillar has now resisted rusting for over 1,600 years. When you read about achievements like these, it sounds like a utopia. But modern archaeologists and historians are digging past the poetry and the ironwork to ask a harder question. Who did this prosperity actually serve? We are going to conduct an historical audit of the Gupta period. We will look at the receipts, view the ruins, and read the records to see if the reality of daily life lived up to the Golden Age myth. To build a state that produces great science and art, you first need overwhelming capital. The Gupta Empire generated this by maintaining absolute ownership over all land. District officials, known as pustapalas, rigorously tracked every single land transaction to ensure taxes flowed directly to the royal treasury. This chart maps how that domestic wealth was multiplied by a massive global export market. Indian merchants shipped Bengal textiles, Himalayan scents, spices, and silk along coastal routes, stretching west to the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire, and east into Southeast Asia. The physical receipts for this economic growth are the empire's gold coins, called dinars. Early coins depict rulers in aggressive martial poses, like archers and tiger slayers. Later generations issued coins showing kings calmly playing the veena, a stringed instrument. You don't put musicians on your currency if you are fighting for your survival. This influx of global trade and domestic stability created the exact financial surplus required to ignite a cultural explosion. With the borders secured and the treasury full, Gupta society began synthesizing centuries of older, scattered Indian traditions into highly elevated forms of art and architecture. Builders moved away from carving into existing rock faces and began constructing freestanding structural temples out of brick and stone. The Dashavatara temple in Uttar Pradesh survives as a prime example of the new, highly ornamented Nagara style of architecture. The state's wealth also flowed into Buddhist sites. Royal patronage funded massive, large-scale renovations of structural monuments, like the Demek Stupa at Sarnath. Inside these temples, sculpture evolved dramatically. The older Gandhara school relied heavily on Greek influence, but the indigenous Sarnath school emerged with a far more refined aesthetic, depicting figures without the heavy, realistic folds in their clothing. At the exact same time, Hindu stone iconography expanded in scale and complexity. At the Udayagiri caves, sculptors carved this massive, intricate relief of Varaha, the great boar avatar of Vishnu. This wave of creation extended well beyond physical stone. Sanskrit poetry and drama reached their absolute peak. Writers finalized massive epics like the Mahabharata, and authors like Kalidasa produced globally recognized literary masterpieces. This abstract animation represents the geometric principles explored by the mathematician Aryabhata. He accurately calculated pi to 3.14 and published theories that the Earth rotated around the Sun, centuries before European astronomers caught up. The sheer volume of this intellectual, architectural, and artistic output builds an overwhelming case for the title of a golden age. But that is only true if you limit your audit to the lives of the elites. The cracks in the empire's foundation appeared during the reign of Skandagupta. Constant, devastating invasions by the Hunas drained the royal treasury and shattered the long era of peace. We can track this economic collapse in the dirt. The pristine gold dinars from earlier decades were replaced by heavily debased, impure currency as the state ran out of precious metals to fund its defense. But even before the treasury ran dry, the reality for everyday citizens stood in stark contrast to the high culture enjoyed by the royal courts. The historical record shows a severe, systemic decline in the societal status of women. It is under the Gupta rule that we see the first formalized evidence of the practice of sati. This diagram illustrates the sharp entrenchment of social classes at the time. The caste system became highly rigid, and certain groups of people were pushed out of the social structure entirely, formally categorized as untouchables. So, while astronomical discoveries and flawless stone carvings flowed upward to the king, social mobility, individual freedom, and equality were actively crushed at the bottom. The Gupta period left a legacy that shaped modern Indian culture and global mathematics. By the standard metrics of wealth and art, it passes the audit. But the physical evidence proves a lasting truth. An era of soaring intellectual brilliance does not guarantee an era of human rights. By the year 600 AD, the massive Gupta Empire had fractured. The Indian subcontinent was split into a patchwork of fiercely territorial kingdoms, locked in a brutal cycle of regional warfare. This chart illustrates the sheer scale of the army that finally brought those warring states to heel. Under the command of Emperor Harshavardhana, an overwhelming force of 100,000 infantry and 60,000 war elephants rolled across northern India, crushing all opposition. Yet the man commanding this massive military apparatus spent his downtime writing Sanskrit plays. Every 5 years, he would intentionally empty his entire imperial treasury, giving away his wealth to scholars, monks, and the poor. He devoted decades to building a formidable military state, yet he spent his reign systematically stripping that state of the very resources required to survive him. Harsha never expected to inherit the throne. He took power at just 16, following a sudden chain of disasters. His father died, the ruler of Bengal assassinated his older brother, and his sister was kidnapped. Rather than a reckless frontal assault, he allied with the king of Assam, creating a pincer movement, squeezing Bengal's forces. From there, he spent decades absorbing territories. His borders stretched from the Himalayas to the Narmada River, earning him the title Lord of the North. But geography eventually forced a hard stop. Attempting to crossing the Narmada River south, he ran straight into the forces of the Chalukya king, Pulakeshin II, who dealt Harsha a decisive defeat. We know this because the Chalukyas quite literally carved it in stone. These ancient Sanskrit inscriptions recount how the so-called Lord of the North was stopped in his tracks. The defeat exposed a stark reality. The massive territory projected strength, but that strength relied almost entirely on Harsha's personal strategic brilliance. Beneath the surface, the administration holding those territories together was remarkably brittle. This flowchart maps how the empire functioned. Instead of a centralized bureaucracy collecting taxes, Harsha paid military commanders with permanent land grants. Wealth accumulated regionally. Local lords kept the lion's share, sending only a nominal tribute to the emperor. At the same time, Harsha was making massive investments in education and culture. To fund the great ancient university at Nalanda, he diverted the tax revenue of 100 surrounding villages directly to the institution. His priorities were shifting. Influenced by the traveling Chinese scholarmond Xuanzang, the warlord who conquered the north began pivoting toward pacifism and Mahayana Buddhism. This ideological shift culminated in the massive assemblies at Prayag and Kannauj. Here, Harsha instituted a policy of giving away whatever surplus wealth the state accumulated over the previous 5 years to monks, scholars, and the poor. He was trading land for loyalty while simultaneously draining his own bank accounts for charity. By willingly stripping the central government of its liquid wealth and direct control over land, he left the state completely broke in a crisis. Despite these vulnerabilities, the system worked for 40 years. Harsha held the vast empire together through sheer force of personality, endless administrative tours across his lands, and the lingering terror of his early military campaigns. But the moment he died without a clear, powerful successor to take the reins, the regional lords realized they held all the actual land and resources. They immediately rebelled, breaking the territory apart. An empire built entirely on the charisma of a single individual, devoid of strong central institutions and a deep treasury, will shatter the instant that individual is gone. Because of his towering historical presence, Harshavardhana is frequently labeled by modern accounts as the last great Hindu emperor of India. The facts point elsewhere. His borders never crossed the southern half of the subcontinent. His personal devotion leaned heavily toward Buddhism in his later years, and major Hindu empires rose centuries after his death. Harsha's true legacy defines the absolute limits of personal rule. He proved that while a single leader can unify half a continent, the empire cannot survive the man if it lacks the systems to sustain itself. In the 7th century, the death of King Harsha collapsed the dominant power structure in North India. The subcontinent fragmented into a volatile power vacuum. Out of this chaos, a focal point emerged as the ultimate prize, the city of Kannauj. It commanded an immediate geographic advantage, built defensively on a high cliff along the Ganges, elevating it above the river valley. But its true value was macroeconomic. Kannauj operated as the essential trade nexus linking the massive agricultural yields of the Ganga Valley to the highly lucrative maritime seaports of Gujarat. Whoever controlled this specific geographic choke point effectively commanded the economic engine of all North India. Between 800 and 1000 AD, 3 resource-rich empires rose to the height of their power, and all 3 converged on this single geographic linchpin. In the east, the Pala Empire dominated Bengal and Bihar. In the west and north, the Gurjara Pratiharas stretched across Rajasthan and Malwa. And in the south, the Rashtrakutas projected power from the Deccan Plateau. These three massive states engaged in a 200-year zero-sum war for Kannauj, a war that resulted in a permanent geopolitical deadlock and ultimately broke the political cohesion of North India. To understand why none could secure a lasting victory, we must first deconstruct the unique economic engines that funded their respective war machines. We begin in the east. Around 750 AD, regional elites elected a soldier named Gopala to end local anarchy, formally establishing the Pala Empire. They faced an immediate macroeconomic crisis. The collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of expanding Islamic caliphates in West Asia severely disrupted India's traditional overland trade routes. The Palas responded with a massive strategic pivot. They bypassed the blocked western overland routes by turning to the ocean, establishing vast maritime trade networks with Southeast Asia that flooded Bengal with foreign silver and gold. Diplomatic records show they forged highly lucrative relationships with maritime powers like the Shailendra dynasty of modern-day Indonesia, securing immense international wealth. The Palas converted this capital into soft power, heavily patronizing massive Buddhist universities that functioned as international centers of learning. Under Dharmapala, they revived Nalanda and built the Vikramashila University, drawing scholars from as far away as Tibet and projecting cultural influence across Asia. The Palas possessed immense financial resources, but their geographic center of gravity was heavily anchored far to the east. In the west, the Gurjara Pratiharas rebuilt their state under ambitious kings like Nagabhata and the great Mihira Bhoja, pushing steadily eastward to capture Kannauj. Their geopolitical imperative was straightforward. They had to secure the essential overland links connecting the Ganga Valley to the vital seaports of Gujarat. However, they carried a massive defensive burden. The Pratiharas acted as the primary military bulwark against Arab armies invading from Sindh. This forced the state into a permanent, highly expensive posture of military readiness. Despite these military hostilities, intellectual exchange thrived. Pratihara scholars regularly traveled to Baghdad, introducing Indian mathematics, algebra, and medicine to the Arab world. To maintain their massive standing army, they also relied heavily on importing high-quality war horses from Central Asia through the northwest. The Pratiharas held the most advantageous geographic position near Kannauj, but their resources were systematically drained by fighting constant multi-front wars. Finally, we look south. Founded by Dantadurga, the Rashtrakutas maintained their capital deep within the Deccan Plateau, safely insulated from northern threats. They utilized a highly cosmopolitan economic policy, actively permitting Islamic merchants to settle and preach within their borders, significantly boosted their foreign trade revenues. Militarily, instead of attempting to permanently annex the distant Ganga Valley, rulers like Govinda III deployed highly mobile cavalries to execute devastating, long-range strikes. These raids were strictly extractive. Their objective was to siphon massive plunders from the northern kings, bleeding rival treasuries dry to fund the Rashtrakuta state. They channeled this looted wealth into unparalleled architectural feats back home, financing massive monolithic structures like those commissioned by Krishna I. The Rashtrakutas operated as systemic disruptors. They rarely stayed to rule the north, possessing the exact localized military force needed to shatter anyone else's hegemony. A geographical deadlock emerges. 1. Western Pratiharas strike east. 2. Rashtrakuta cavalry exploits their exposed flank, routing them north. 3. Rashtrakutas retreat with plunder, leaving Kannauj empty. 4. Palas claim the vacant city until Pratiharas rebuild, repeating the cycle. The tripartite struggle functioned as a mathematical equilibrium trap. No single empire possessed the logistical capacity to stretch its supply lines and hold Kannauj permanently. Decades of continuous warfare placed a staggering administrative toll on all three states. To extract constant revenue for their militaries, kings began ruthlessly subdividing their lands. A strict hierarchy of extraction was established. Territories were fractured into provinces, then down to districts, and finally clustered into local village units, all optimized to feed the war machine. By the year 915 AD, the extraction system finally buckled under the weight of the conflict. The Rashtrakuta king Indra III launched a devastating campaign deep into the north, breached the defenses, and physically destroyed the city of Kannauj. In the immediate aftermath, the weakened Pratiharas completely lost control of the vital Gujarat seacoast, permanently severing their access to overseas trade. By destroying the city and severing the maritime routes, the Rashtrakutas didn't win the prize. They broke the specific economic engine that made North India worth fighting for. This timeline tracks the Pala, Pratihara, and Rashtrakuta empires. After 2 centuries, all 3 experience a rapid collapse between 960 and 980 AD. Exhausted Rashtrakutas are overthrown by vassals in 979. Bankrupt Pratiharas violently fracture into dozens of smaller principalities. These 3 powers financed a golden age of temple architecture, regional literature, and artistic patronage. Yet their geopolitical legacy is one of absolute mutual destruction. This total systemic collapse created an immense power vacuum. By the 11th century, Islamic forces from West and Central Asia rapidly crossed into the subcontinent. Leaders like Mahmud of Ghazni launched repeated, devastating invasions. These incursions succeeded specifically because the native empires of the Indian subcontinent had spent 2 centuries bleeding themselves dry. The tripartite struggle demonstrates a brutal historical reality, a war where all sides are too strong to lose, but too geographically constrained to win, will inevitably destroy the very world they are fighting to rule. When we think of the great Indian empires, the Mauryas, the Guptas, the Mughals, we usually picture massive land armies dominating the Ganges plains, their expansion defined by the physical boundaries of the Himalayas. The Chola dynasty projected its power directly across the ocean. Instead of competing for territory within the subcontinent's interior, they looked outward toward the horizon. From their base in the Kaveri Delta, Chola influence moved across the water to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, eventually stretching across the Bay of Bengal and into the Malay Peninsula. To understand India's first transoceanic empire, we have to look past traditional border disputes and examine the control of international supply chains. By the 9th century, North India was locked in a stalemate. The Palas, Rashtrakutas, and Pratiharas were consumed by the tripartite struggle, a long-term conflict for the city of Kannauj that left all 3 powers exhausted. The south was equally fractured, with the ruling Pallava and Tandya dynasties focused entirely on their own internal rivalries for regional control. A local feudatory named Vijayalaya Chola recognized this distraction. He moved to capture Thanjavur while the primary dynasties were preoccupied, establishing it as the permanent capital of a new imperial line. Capturing Thanjavur made them the new masters of the south. But to fund a fleet capable of crossing oceans, they would have to secure the wealth generated by the sea. Building a world-class navy required an efficient domestic economy. The Cholas focused their engineering efforts on maximizing the output of the Kaveri Delta. They constructed the Solegangam water tank, a 16-mile-long reservoir that served as a massive drought insurance policy, guaranteeing the agricultural surplus needed to maintain an army and a fleet. This economic surplus was consolidated into temple networks like the Brihadisvara temple. These were more than religious sites. They were engineering feats built from precision-cut granite that functioned as centers for finance, welfare, and public works. To maintain stability, the Cholas relied on autonomous local assemblies called the Or and Sabha. These councils managed land records, taxation, and local law without requiring constant intervention from the king. This decentralized system ensured the homeland remained stable, while the kings turned their attention to foreign conquests and the control of global trade. For generations, Tamil merchant guilds held a monopoly over the maritime Silk Route. They controlled the flow of goods moving from the Abbasid Caliphate in the west to the markets of China in the east, with South Indian ports serving as the primary transition points. However, as shipbuilding techniques improved, vessels began traveling longer distances without needing to refuel. This allowed international ships to bypass India entirely, moving straight toward ports on the Malay Peninsula. The Srivijaya Empire in Southeast Asia controlled this new trade bottleneck. They began utilizing their position to discriminate against the Tamil merchant guilds, threatening to cut off the Cholas' primary source of wealth. The Cholas were forced to make a choice: use military force to protect their merchant guilds, or watch their economic power vanish. King Rajendra I launched a massive naval armada across the open ocean to strike the Srivijaya Empire directly. It was a risky and deliberate decision to take the fight to a distant rival's doorstep. Rajendra had no intention of actually governing this distant territory. The logistics of a permanent occupation across the Bay of Bengal were far too costly. His objective was specific: cripple the Srivijaya military, install proxy rulers who would favor Chola interests, and secure physical access to the Malay trade ports. This strategy is often described as pseudo-colonialism, using military power to control a foreign nation's economic resources without the burden of long-term territorial administration. The outcome was a century of uninterrupted global economic control. By securing the trade routes through force, the Cholas ensured their prosperity without the drain of an overseas occupation. Eventually, the empire began to crumble under the weight of geographical overextension. Coordinated uprisings from the Sinhala, Hoysala, and Pandya kingdoms began to push the Chola borders back toward the Kaveri Delta. By 1279, the Pandyas decisively ended Chola rule in India. But a rebel faction of the dynasty managed to survive. They fled across the ocean to the Philippines, establishing a kingdom in Cebu that maintained its independence until the 16th century. Their mastery of oceanic travel allowed the royal bloodline to persist long after their political power in India had vanished. The Cholas left behind a cultural legacy that outlasted their military. The intricate bronze artistry of the Nataraja, representing the cosmic dance of creation, remains a defining symbol of Indian craftsmanship today. Their local assemblies, the and Sabha, functioned as autonomous units, managing their own land and law, a level of grassroots self-rule that proved incredibly resilient. This tradition of village-level governance persisted through centuries of political change, providing a historical anchor for Mahatma Gandhi's vision of village republics and the modern Panchayati Raj system. The imperial Cholas established a definitive blueprint for transoceanic geopolitics and global economic monopolies, creating a model for power that reached far beyond the traditional borders of the subcontinent. Between 200 BC and 300 AD, South India was a hub of global commerce. Port cities bustled with merchants trading ivory and spices for Roman gold, operating within a sophisticated economy fueled by widely circulating coins. This era of international wealth funded immense cultural projects, like the Great Stupa at Sanchi. These monuments stand as physical proof of the massive scale of Buddhist architecture that early trade networks supported. But around 300 AD, that engine stalled. International trade routes dried up, urbanization reversed as towns were abandoned, and the gold and copper coins that drove daily life nearly disappeared. This collapse left a vacuum. For the societies that remained, survival required a total, desperate pivot away from the sea and toward a new, land-based source of wealth. 3 regional powers emerged to fight for what was left: the Chalukyas in the west, the Pallavas in the east, and the Pandyas in the south. Without Roman trade, these kings turned to the soil, seeking to build an agrarian state. The key was this specific stretch of land between the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers. This basin was the most fertile territory, making it the ultimate prize. The need to control this valley ignited a brutal, multi-generational conflict that would consume the region for the next 200 years. These were high-stakes resource wars. They weren't fighting over prestige. They were fighting for the only surplus that could still fund an empire: grain. The Chalukyas struck first. King Pulakesin II pushed his armies across the peninsula, seizing territory all the way to the Pallava border. The Pallavas eventually retaliated with a devastating counter-invasion. Under King Narasimhavarman, they marched into the Chalukya heartland and sacked their capital city, Vatapi. Sustaining these decades of invasion required a massive extraction of wealth. The state demanded gold and grain from every corner of the realm to keep the infantry fed and the war machine moving. Most of this burden fell on the the standard peasant villages. Beyond taxes, the kings demanded wood, grass, and even forced labor, compelling villagers to carry heavy loads for the army without pay. However, this brute force was highly inefficient. To maintain their wars, the kings needed a more reliable way to centralize the grain and labor of the countryside. They needed a tool that could turn the chaos of conquest into a predictable, managed bureaucracy. The solution was the Brahmadeya, large grants of tax-free land given directly to brahmanas. These grants created a new managerial class. These priests oversaw the agricultural output and enforced the state's authority, while providing the religious rituals that legitimized the king's rule. This administrative power was anchored by monumental stone temples. The Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram functioned as a public ledger. Details of land grants and tax exemptions were carved directly into the stone walls, making the temple the final authority on the region's wealth. By the early medieval period, temple institutions owned 3/5 of all arable land. With so much land, they enforced a rigid caste-based hierarchy, keeping peasant labor tied to the fields to ensure a steady flow of resources to the top. These temples had become the central banks and administrative hubs of the new agrarian economy. By the mid-8th century, the 200 years of constant warfare had backfired. The relentless struggle for the river basins had completely exhausted the treasuries and the armies of both empires. The Chalukyas were eventually toppled by the Rashtrakutas, and the Pallavas lost their grip on the east. The dynasties that built the system were gone, yet the system they built was self-sustaining. While the kings fell, the temple economy thrived, and the rise of the Bhakti movement, a new, popular form of devotion, integrated the common people even more deeply into this temple-centric world. The political map changed, but the underlying socio-economic machine remained intact. This era left a permanent mark on the landscape. Massive complexes like the Kailasanathar temple replaced the open trade hubs of the past with fortified centers of stone and script. The shift was comprehensive. Sanskrit replaced local dialects as the language of the elite, and the Brahmanical hierarchy became the permanent skeleton of southern society. These early stone banks eventually grew into the massive landmarks that dominate the region's modern skyline, continuing a legacy that began with the search for fertile soil. The exhaustion of the Pallava and Chalukya armies left behind a new social order. By centering the entire economy on the soil and the shrine, they turned South India into the land of temples.